The great economic ecologist in Canada, Bill Rees, he said to me the other day, he said essentially, quit talking about what you want. Talk about how you're going to get it. This is not the age of ideas anymore. This is the age of implementation. The basic ideas about what needs to be done are out there.
You're listening to the Rewilding Earth Podcast. Six years ago, on episode 22, I spoke with conservation legend Randy Hayes, founder of Rainforest Action Network, as he outlined his ambitious 500-year plan for a sustainable society. Today, the stakes are higher, the urgency is greater, and Randy returns with a powerful new call to action, a roadmap to rectify humanity's relentless assault on nature. From the legendary cracking of Glen Canyon Dam alongside Dave Foreman and Edward Abbey, to decades of tireless advocacy, Randy's voice is a clarion call humanity can no longer afford to ignore. It's time to take bold, sweeping action if we're to have any chance of softening the landing from the damage already done to the planet. And Randy has a plan to do just that.
This audience knows that humanity is destroying a livable planet. What I've been up to is essentially trying to figure out what kind of a campaign, what kind of an effort would really address that at scale. And otherwise, future generations of all life don't have much of a chance, right? What I've come up with is that 5 societal systems could really lift our collective foot off the throat of nature. It would require major pressure campaigns in the largest economies, like the 20 largest economies, the G20, which is not just Western Europe and North America, it's also India and China. But even that's not enough. It would require a massive educational effort to let people know about why this has to be. And I'm thinking successful lawsuits against the 100 biggest polluters of the planet, right? And that has to be amplified with the usual top-down lobbying effort. So from the bottom up of the campaigns to the top down to all the way around with an educational effort, this still won't be easy. The level of change won't be easy for people or society to adjust to, but it's necessary if we want future generations to flourish. And so all that done with real determination year after year could be a path to an ecological civilization, and that could be our legacy. That's what I've been up to.
Is that all? So you've continued with your very big scale thinking, and I love that. Chris Tompkins was on not too long ago encouraging all of us to do the very same thing. Think very big now, be very bold, and I'd say what you're talking about here fits that to a T.
The 5 societal systems that I have in mind, people have their particular passions, but I come primarily with an ecological perspective. And even in terms of, say, the economic system, I'm thinking about the biggest short-term gain would be the reduction of subsidies to all extractive industries. So that's not just oil and gas or hard rock mining. It's also logging out of a natural forest is an extractive industry. Industrial fishing of the oceans is an extractive industry. And so that would be one of the 5 systems. But the other systems are the energy consumption system and the energy production system, the agricultural production system, and the planet's life support system. I break the energy system into 2 systems because I'm sick and tired of primarily just hearing about wind and solar are going to save the day.
Yeah.
That's not enough. And that's the production system. It says nothing about the energy consumption system. We ought to be looking at the 20 largest economies, the G20, cutting their overall energy use in half, right? Quit producing stupid stuff. This is an emergency.
What would fall into the stupid stuff category for you, just off the top of your head today?
The simplest example would be, say, making plastic toys in a place like China, loading them up in super tankers to ship to all the other continents. That would be a stupid stuff example.
That's a good example. Also, just back to your energy thing, that too has really driven me nuts. I think it does a lot of our listeners as well. Nobody really talks about us cutting anything. It's just on the production side, as if we don't immediately gobble up all of that new wind and solar that they bring online the minute that they do it.
Yeah, and even the wind and solar people are sucking wind, so to speak, right now because AI requires so much electricity that they're having to reestablish nuclear power plants that had been shut down to cover that energy need and energy abuse.
Yeah, we have gotten pretty much in the mood for nothing that has anything to do with curtailing our use of energy or choices in buying things. And I wanted to ask you, you talked about education, you talked about the really big things that need to happen to one day arrive at something we could call it an ecological society.
Yeah, when I talk about an educational campaign surrounding this sort of system shift, I really mean a media campaign, a communications campaign, a public relations campaign, more than going to K through 12, right, in an educational sense. Of course, that needs to happen as well, but we're on a short fuse here.
Yeah.
This is late in the 11th hour, as this audience knows. And I'm thinking my budget for the first 3 years was $32 million just to launch a campaign of this scale. That kind of money is sloshing around, but you have to have a serious implementation plan to access it. And we haven't gotten there yet, but that's the drive.
It's pretty simple from where we sit what needs to happen, but just a simple fact of raising an easy 32 million, which really is not that impressive of a number anymore,
No,
is complicated by the fact that you're trying to do it within the system that this is going to have an insane effect on for good reasons and in a good way, but not everybody's going to see it that way.
they're not going to see it that way. They're going to fight. A lot of people are going to fight this kind of a campaign. And that's just the nature of where we are on planet Earth at this point in time. We were born in a dark age, as my friend Ernest Collenbach used to tell me. Back in my 20s, I didn't quite understand that. But what he really meant was the last 200 years of industrial civilization. We were, in fact, born in a dark age. And the momentum in the wrong direction is powerful. But that's where we're at. And we either confront it, we either go for a great ecological U-turn to a better world, an ecological civilization, or we perish. And I, at times, don't so much know if I care whether human species perishes, because we don't seem to fit on this planet. We're the only species that does this level of destruction. But right now, we need humanity to embrace that we can live in harmony with the web of life. And how do we construct that kind of a campaign in meaningful terms? That's the task at hand. That's what we have to throw our shoulders behind.
And with the five areas that you're talking about, they're five of the biggest areas on purpose of how humans are affecting this planet. You talk about having detailed roadmaps in all five systems. I like the way that you use roadmap because it makes me feel like that's a plan that sounds like it's got enough detail to make sense and something that we can follow.
The great economic ecologist in Canada, Bill Rees, he said to me the other day, he said essentially, quit talking about what you want. Talk about how you're going to get it. This is not the age of ideas anymore. This is the age of implementation. The basic ideas about what needs to be done are out there. And so how do we implement that? And roadmaps provide the level of detail about how you're going to get from A to B, right? Or from A to Z. And so some of the roadmaps for these economic systems are from these different five systems have been written decently and some have not. But that doesn't mean we couldn't pull together the right people, draft the roadmaps. That'll be an ongoing process of learning and adjusting over time. There are lots of roadmaps already written for, say, 100% renewable energy. Stanford University's produced one. I think that it's faulty thinking in many respects, because if you don't reduce the amount of energy that is currently required and growing, then we're never going to get to 100% renewable energy for quite a number of reasons. Even just the rare minerals and metals required for wind and solar are a showstopper to getting to 100% renewable energy if the pie keeps getting bigger. And with my agricultural production system, shifting to 100% ecological farming globally is the goal, right? The end of industrial agriculture. That roadmap has not been written. There are components of it. The International Society of Agroecologists have a lot to say about what needs to be done, but there's no on-the-ground campaign of consequence to make that happen, and that's what has to be launched. And the fifth system was, I simply call it the planet's life support system, but it's really protecting the web of life by halting the pollution and the expansion into habitat primarily. And this is the stuff of nature needs half, or 30 by 30, protecting 30% of the planet by 2030. And then some would say 40 by 2040 and 50% by 2050. But there's science behind nature needs half, right? If you have an ecological system with unique flora and fauna, and you can protect at least 50% of that system, you might be able to protect 90% plus of the species in that system, right? So half of every continent, half of the oceans, half of every major island set aside for habitat, because the web of life, particularly the insect world, is really seriously damaged. This audience will know that 50 to 70% of the insect world has disappeared on us, and that's not okay. But humanity at large doesn't realize that we need the web of life for our species to exist. And that's part of the education campaign as well.
Well, my big thing is rewilding, because it feels like the overarching thing. If you're focused on that, you're going to have a shift in the agricultural production system, the energy production and consumption, and the economic system. It doesn't get into those government subsidies necessarily, but it feels clean. Is it naive to think that way? Because when you lay out your roadmap, you know what I'm going to glom onto, and it's going to be the rewilding stuff and things that have to do with that.
Sure. There is still relatively pristine habitat to protect, but rewilding is fundamentally the name of the game in terms of the planet's life support system at this point. And I remind people often that even the term itself came from Dave Foreman. But to my understanding, he's the one who really coined that word.
Yeah.
And it's caught on around the planet wonderfully at this point. I was just over a couple of years ago at the climate COP, the big annual climate meeting in Glasgow in Scotland. And in Scotland, there's all kinds of rewilding efforts. Bringing back the beaver there was very exciting for those people. And I just keep hearing more and more about it. It's a powerful term in its own sense. And the roadmaps for rewilding and nature needs half, they're out there. Of all things, Conservation International has written a pretty good roadmap on global rewilding and priorities and areas. And it's just a wonderful, positive approach, but we've got to do it hand in hand with these other major system shifts, or we're not going to be able to get the rewilding done, in my opinion.
Agriculturally, I think, is probably one of the biggest and easiest ones to look at. Are we doing our food system in a way that we could be doing different and not take up the entire flyover portion of America to do it, to feed ourselves, or feed our animals to feed ourselves? And then if we don't need that level of production, then it needs to be rewilded. That's the way I think of it. Is that how you're looking at it?
It is. Shifting to 100% ecological farming globally, right? The end of industrial agriculture is an act of rewilding in many respects. Even going from dead industrial soil to once again fertile soils is a rewilding of the soils.
Yeah.
But there's ecological farming implies a lot of other aspects of rewilding in terms of that. And agroecology has the word ecology in it, which is a science, really gets us back to that kind of living in harmony with the ways of nature, which is in fact rewilding.
Yeah. The energy production and consumption. I've already given you almost every idea that I have about that today on this show, which isn't much. It's just we're using too much and we're not talking about stopping doing that. And we use the wrong kind of energy. There's my experience with it. And I'm even a little foggier on the economic system, other than, yeah, subsidies, all of that stuff seems really obvious. If we're really capitalists and we're a capitalist system, why in the world can't you be competitive enough without your subsidies?
I put a lot of thought for a couple of years. When I stepped down from running Rainforest Action Network, I went into 7 years of green city government where I was
Oh,
president
okay.
of the Commission of the Environment of San Francisco for 5 years, and then director of sustainability for the city of Oakland when Jerry Brown, the governor, but when he was mayor of Oakland, right? And I had the time to think, can we ecologize capitalism? Conceptually, we know how to do that. Herman Daly and ecological economics laid out the foundation for that. But I like to think of it in terms of a true cost economy. If the goods and services in the economy had to cover their pollution costs to the earth in a true cost economy, a lot of bad activity would not happen, right? In the economic system, if we reduce government subsidies to extractive industries, most of those industries would not be profitable without the subsidies. Guess what changes in the world of commerce if a business is not profitable? Quite a lot changes.
Yeah.
And we know how much these industries will try to protect their subsidies. And we've known for 20, 30, 40 years that we need a campaign to cut government subsidies to the wrong activities. I think the time has come where that kind of a campaign can be launched, right? And that would give us a much more true cost economy. That would ecologize capitalism. I don't think that's the final answer for the long-term future of humanity and the web of life on this planet, but that's the only economic system with any wind in its sail right now. And we've got to radically reduce the harm that it does. And cutting government subsidies is the biggest ticket way to do that. It's the low-hanging fruit, as they say.
In one sense, but what do you say about that in light of our current political situation? The richest man in the world bought his way into the government so that he could protect his subsidies and all of the ways that his companies make money. And every one of the five systems, in one way or another, touch on the broligarchy, who is now completely in charge of everything. And they have right now, at least on paper, the power. Because though the people have the power, the people ain't using it. And they are, and they have the money and everything else. So, like, how do you temper that in your own mind to go, okay, we're really going after the people who have the best way of protecting the status quo that you could ever be set up to do on this planet?
Oh, there's no question that we've just experienced a major downshift in terms of anti-nature activities. And it's frightening. But on the other hand, as I've said earlier, we were born in dark times. The last 200 years of industrial revolution are pretty dark times. And even if you look at, say, the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party here in the United States, they were no bastions of ecological living, the Democrats. There is a distinction between the two major parties that matters. But this current downturn, it may undercut our efforts or not. It may shift in 2 years, 4 years, 6 years. But that's just the United States of America. And of course, the United States of America is still the engines of the global economy, but there are other parts of the planet. And we're talking about a global campaign here. And I know it looks bad because it is bad right now. It just got worse. On the other hand, as the cliche goes, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. If you look at the European Union, there's still a lot more promise over there than there is currently here in the US. And I've been in touch with a number of people over in the European Union and the UK around this kind of a campaign. The Club of Rome has a very similar idea, and they published it in a book called Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity. And that's really an update of the classic book that many of your listeners will know from Donella Meadows and others back in 1972, a book called The Limits to Growth that showed a kind of systems modeling of the biosphere. And essentially said back in 1972 that around 2050, all things are going to fall apart if we don't make a change from business as usual. We haven't made that change from business as usual, but we still need that great societal U-turn to a better world. We need to reverse our directions. I used to talk to David Brower about this when I was starting Rainforest Action Network, and he, along with luminaries like Fritjof Capra and Joanna Macy, would talk about a great U-turn to the better world. And I like that imagery because it's going a fundamentally different direction. And so we ultimately have to go a fundamentally different direction with the economic system itself. It's got to be shifted to an ecological economy. We've got to go to a consumption system that's fundamentally different in the sense of low impact living. We've got to go to an energy production system that's 100% renewable, and an agricultural system and the planet's life support. We've got to make the U-turn from business as usual. And the thing that people like the rewilding audience, what we all have in common is we want to tell the ecological truth as best we can. And so that now has to get out there outside of the preservation of wilderness circles, outside of the rewilding circles. It's got to get into the general economy, and hence the idea of a massive communications and media campaign with that ecological truth, talking about this great sort of U-turn to an ecological civilization. If we can't get that going, then I don't know what else to do at this point, frankly.
There are a lot of influencers out there talking about all of the topics and more that you just listed off, and they don't have the ecological education or background to necessarily be hitting all the truth points, as you said, in terms of how you get critical mass. If our campaigns go toward those influencers and getting them up to speed on what they could do to improve their message to people who may follow them in the millions.
Yeah, one of the major partnerships that I'm looking at right now is with a woman named Frankie Oliver over in London, who's out of the kind of media communications world. She put in a couple of decades of mainstream work there, probably for the evil empire, but she learned a lot of the skills, and she understands from a systems perspective what's needed to protect the biosphere and to make these kind of 5 system shifts. And she brings that sort of communication background to the table, including the influencers, and wants to reach out through a lot of talk shows, including YouTube talk shows, not just the major TV and radio talk shows, but as a way to get the message out there and to help regular folks come to understand the need for this kind of a shift, and focusing on the kind of systems change, the specific system changes, and just leveling with people that, yeah, it's going to be hard. There's going to be major shutdowns of significant employment industries, and people are going to be out of work. So how do we take care of them properly? There are people, say at the Club of Rome, looking at universal basic income and ways in which the social safety net legitimately takes care of people if they lose their job because it was a heavily polluting industry that had to be shut down.
Yeah, and we've never really been as good as those guys when they start their propaganda campaigns. We haven't traditionally answered very well with as much creativity and money and exposure. And I think that has to change too, right? We haven't traditionally been relentless, ultra good at publicity, getting out there with a message in front of as many people as possible and doing it like they've done it. They've won the day. We've got the world systems that we do now because those guys have done a better job and had more money and resources to do an awful lot of propagandizing. And we haven't been able to fight that messaging to the point where now we have this huge population of humans that have lost their connection to nature, sufficient to make them care enough to make sure that we're getting the changes that we need and get people in power that align with the beliefs of the majority, which I don't know what the majority belief is at the moment.
The majority belief is not on our side at the moment,
I
but
didn't
that's
want to say it.
part of the U-turn shift, and that's part of the media campaign that we have in mind. If I go back, say, maybe even a decade, I thought that the extreme weather events like Category 5 hurricanes like Katrina and Sandy might create the political will, might be scary enough to broad enough numbers of people to create the political will for the kind of changes to get our foot off the throat of nature. That didn't happen. On the other hand, the biosphere is getting spastic, and the ecospasms around the corner are going to be far greater than the Category 5 kind of hurricanes, which are already pretty devastating if you're in that region. And we're seeing that, of course, already across the planet, but it'll get worse. And the great fragility of industrial civilization is industrial agriculture. Because of the extreme weather events that will continue to grow, there's going to be a reduction of production on a massive level, not too many years in the future. There's going to be food prices skyrocketing. They already are, and that will get worse. So that's the great fragility. And maybe that will begin to create the political will, but only if that window of opportunity opens up. We got to be ready to jump through it. And that's what these sort of 5 societal systems and the shift to a better world is about, saying, here's the roadmap, so to speak, on getting to a better world, getting to ecological civilizations. And that's the positive nature of this campaign. So in many respects, it could be driven as a good news effort. People aren't going to get that initially, but they're eventually going to get it if we can get out there and keep pounding away to those influencers, like you mentioned.
Another positive thing about what you're saying is the fact that you're interested in laying out roadmaps and you're going to have a plan because people are lost at sea a little bit. I think it's incredibly positive to come from that angle and say, yeah, we have some really big changes to make, but there is a plan.
I think in terms of that kind of planning a lot, if I had my magic wand, there would be continental networks of bioregional economies. Bioregional economy implies a low impact lifestyle. It implies a lot of rewilding, at least in my mind, it does. And each continent could be 95% self sufficient on not just food, clothing, and shelter, but comfort items in life, and be ecological civilizations, so to speak. What we should be trading globally, in my mind, again, with my magic wand, would be art, culture, and ideas, not so much physical stuff. I say 95% self-sufficient in terms of each continent. That leaves a little room for coffee and chocolate so we don't have rebellion in the streets. But that's how the world used to live if you go back so many hundreds of years. And we could in the future. That's at least how I think in terms of planning.
I looked it up. You were episode 22. You were very early in the podcast, almost 6 years ago. And I'm looking at our topic list, and I was reminded about your 500-year plan, short-term thinking. We're in a different situation now than we were just 6 years ago. How have you changed in your outlook in terms of the difference between your 500-year plan and maybe thinking we had a little more time back then than we now know we do?
Well, 1492, right, was the Columbus's quote discovery of America. And then 500 years later, there was a quincentennial. And that's when I first started thinking about a 500-year plan and said people were looking at a kind of a 500-year celebration of Columbus's quote discovery. And I thought what we really need to do is apologize to the indigenous peoples and set the historic record straight about what that meant in 1492 and the subsequent 500 years. But more importantly, we need to look ahead to the future, to the next 500 years. in essentially developing an ecological civilization here on planet Earth, having humanity get in sync with the ways of nature and rewilding the web of life, right? So that's where that all came from. And back then, we could afford to think about a soft landing. That was the catchphrase, from the damage we're doing to a soft landing, right? There will be no soft landing. There is no time left to orchestrate a soft landing right now. We've done too much damage to the planet. We're already seeing it. And there are major tipping points like the loss of the Amazon or the stopping of the ocean currents in the Atlantic that would bring on an ice age in Northern Europe if that happened, the melting of the permafrost. We know the basics about these tipping points, and they're just a lot closer than they were 30, 40 years ago. And so there will be no soft landing. Will there be a semi-soft landing? There certainly won't be unless we can orchestrate this kind of a major U-turn that I'm talking about with these 5 system shifts.
Yeah.
It's not so much about what we need to do as what we need to stop doing. Hence, the image, get our foot off the throat of nature.
Yeah.
And the downside is that in the sort of global matrix of nation states, a politician pretty much cannot get reelected if they tell the ecological truth, right? Because that's not short-term, that's not good news in the short term for the bulk of the constituents. And so democracy, as we've known it, has a fundamental flaw. And so we need ecologically informed democracy. And we don't have that. And hence the idea of this massive communications campaign funded 35 million for the, or 32 million, 35 million for the first 3 years is just the starting point. It needs to be far better funded in that. I've been thinking in terms of, say, 30 full-page ads in the Financial Times, because the captains of industry and a lot of senior government people read the Financial Times because they're focused on the global economy. And we still have the ethic of growth for the sake of growth. And many of your listeners will remember Edward Abbey's famous statement about that. Growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. Abbey told me that once in a van in the Southwest when I first met him, when he first introduced me to Dave Foreman and Mike Rozelle and the Earth First gang back then at the cracking of Glen Canyon Dam. And these are the things we have to shift.
What do we do next? And how can our listeners and me support you in that endeavor?
For the rewilding people, take a look at that Conservation International roadmap on the nature-based solutions and the 30/30 and rewilding. It's a starting point. I'm sure that people will find ways to improve it. But I think that one of the 5 systems that I've focused on today is the planet's life support system, and protecting habitat and rewilding habitat is the main point of focus right there. And so if that's your particular passion, then get serious about the roadmap. If you're based here in North America, then let's get even more engaged in the bold thinking of connecting up the corridors and all of that work. A lot of that foundational work and thinking has been done. But again, it's not the age of idea, it's the age of implementation. Grab your project and run with it, and all of that adds up. But try to also start to think about the larger package that has to occur if we want to be successful with rewilding. And that goes back to the economic system itself and getting rid of subsidies. That goes back to the energy consumption system and cutting the manufacturing of useless stuff. That goes to the energy production and the 100% renewable energy, and it certainly goes to the agricultural production system and the ending industrial agriculture. Industrial agriculture is still the number 1 cause of the extinction of species. And yet you don't hear that typically from the environmental movement in general. And being a tree hugger like I am, and the Save the Rainforest work that I did at Rainforest Action Network, I didn't take on agriculture as much as I should have. But that lesson's learned, and we have to now. And so hence it's why one of the 5 points of focus.
I remember one of the greatest arguments against, if you did bring up industrial agriculture, the thing that you would hear is, do you want food prices to skyrocket? And now, since we're at the inflection point of food prices skyrocketing, and that argument is completely moot, maybe people will be in a better mood to hear ideas on how to restructure all of this and do it ecologically with nature in mind and in partnership with nature, because we're already paying skyrocketing prices. It took their main argument, the wind out of their sails. Maybe we should take advantage of that.
I mean, if you cut the subsidies to extractive industries, just hypothetically, say 10% a year for 10 years, half of that, and you took half of that money and shifted it over to ecological farming and made it incentives for the shift to ecological farming, we could probably keep the price of food tolerable. And so that would be part of the package. That's part of the great U-turn.
Yeah. As everyone should know by now, unless you're a new listener, a lot of the things that we talked about, especially the reports, other links, are going to be on the extra credit section on the page of this episode. So go to rewilding.org/pod, and you can very easily look up Randy Hayes, find this episode and his other episodes, still relevant. You should probably listen to that one too, because very much relevant to today's discussion. I'll give you a little bit of perspective on Randy's consistency as a systems thinker. We're looking for your leadership, as we always have, Randy, and very much appreciate the work that you're doing. And any way we can help you, we're there for you.
All right. I look forward to a third installment when this effort's a little bit farther down the line and there are more specific ways for people to plug into it. But as I mentioned, the rewilding work is fundamentally important right now. It inspires people. It's catching wind in its sail around the world. And that's really exciting to me. I'm so happy to be on this Rewilding Institute podcast and to still be hanging out with you all, because it was fundamental to my life and to my work, going back to when I first helped make the cracking of Glen Canyon Dam with Edward Abbey and Earth First, that little 11-minute film back in those days. And it was so exciting to hang out with the kind of conservation biologists that were being covered in the Earth First Journal. I've learned a lot from those people, and now we've got to put it into practice.
Paddle forward, as Nancy Morton would say. Thank you, Randy. Really appreciate it. And definitely, I look forward to the third installment.
Let's get this package of activities moving forward. Let's make the great U-turn. Let's build the better world. We need ecological civilizations. We need it in our lifetime. But certainly, future generations require that something like this happens. And I don't mean just future generations of us humans, future generations of all life on Earth.
Thanks for listening to the Rewilding Earth Podcast. We do what we do because of you. This podcast is supported by listeners like you who long to live in a wilder world. Please consider donating at rewilding.org and subscribe to our weekly news and article digest while you're there. To go the extra mile, you can follow and share Rewilding Earth on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Bonus points for sharing this podcast with your friends. To listen to past episodes, go to rewilding.org/pod. That's rewilding.org/pod.